We stalked the mountain lion for hours. It let us get close, on purpose. Ray Blackwood's calloused fingers traced the mountain lion's path on the topographical map spread across the hood of his weathered Ford pickup. 23 years of tracking predators had etched lines into his face that mirrored the contours on the paper before him. 3 attacks in 14 days, said the Fish and Wildlife Officer, a young man with a pressed uniform and clean boots that betrayed his inexperience in the field. 2 livestock, 1 hiker who barely escaped. The depredation permit's been approved. Beside Ray, his son Caleb stood silently, arms crossed over his chest. At 32, he'd inherited his father's height and lean strength, but his eyes held a questioning that Ray's never did. The third member of their party, Mira Chen, scribbled notes in a small notebook. The wildlife biologist had argued against the kill order, but had been overruled. Male cougar, approximately 7 years old based on track size, she said, not looking up. Locals call him Ghost. Appropriate, Ray muttered. In all his years, he'd only caught glimpses of the big cats he hunted. They were shadows, phantoms in the landscape. You're sure it's the same animal? DNA from the hiker's backpack matches scat samples we've collected, Mira confirmed. The GPS coordinates of all 3 incidents fall within a 5-mile radius. Ray folded the map deliberately. The morning sun beat down on the dusty trailhead parking lot, promising a scorching day ahead in the Sierra foothills. October had brought no relief from the summer heat, and the drought had forced wildlife to venture closer to human settlements in search of water. What happens after? Caleb asked, his first words since they'd arrived. After we kill it? Standard protocol. The officer replied. The biologist takes samples. The carcass is transported to UC Davis for study. Ray caught the tightening around Mira's eyes. Scientists never like to see their subjects become specimens. We'll need 3 days, Ray said, calculating distances and terrain. The cat's territory covers rough country. No roads, limited water sources. The attacks are escalating. The officer pressed. We need this resolved quickly. Ray shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of his rifle, water, and supplies. At 58, each hunt taxed his body more than the last. The heat would be merciless, the terrain unforgiving. He'd seen men half his age break under such conditions. We leave now, he said simply. The trio set out as the morning haze still clung to the chaparral. Their boots crunched on the bone-dry trail, raising dust that clung to sweat-dampened skin. Ray led, reading the land like text, noting a broken twig here, displaced soil there. The mountains had nearly killed him 3 times over the years. A fall that shattered his leg, dehydration that left him delirious, a wildfire that nearly trapped him in a box canyon. Yet he returned, drawn by something beyond reason. Behind him, Caleb carried the heavier gear, his military training evident in his efficient movement. Mira followed with her scientific equipment, her slight frame belying her endurance. There, Ray pointed to a scrape mark on a madrone tree. He's marking territory, fresh. The first sign of Ghost. The hunt had begun. By midday, the heat had become a physical weight. The trail meandered through manzanita thickets that tore at exposed skin, leaving thin red scratches that stung with salt sweat. Ray paused at a rocky outcrop, scanning the valley below through binoculars, while Caleb and Mira caught their breath. "Terrain's forcing him east," Ray murmured, more to himself than the others, "away from water." "That doesn't make sense," Mira said, consulting her GPS unit. "The droughts hit this area hard. Why would an apex predator move away from resources?" Caleb unscrewed his canteen, taking a measured sip. They had enough water for 2 days if they rationed carefully. "Something's pushing him." Ray lowered the binoculars, his expression grim. "Another male, maybe. Or humans." The trio descended into a dry creek bed where the skeletal remains of fish lay embedded in cracked mud. Ray crouched suddenly, his hand hovering over a perfect paw print preserved in a patch of softer soil. "He passed through here less than 5 hours ago," Ray said, measuring the print with his fingers. "Full-grown male, slight favor to his left hind leg." "May I?" Mira knelt beside him, camera ready. After photographing the track, she produced a small plaster kit to make a cast. Ray rose, wincing as his knee protested. The old injury from his fall 8 years ago flared with the barometric pressure. He'd been tracking a young male cougar when the ledge gave way beneath him, sending him tumbling 30 feet to the rocks below. 3 days he'd dragged himself toward the trailhead, fashioning a splint from branches and his belt, surviving on stream water and energy bars. The ranger who found him said he'd been hours from death. "You two make camp here," Ray decided. "I'll push ahead. See if I can cut his trail before dark." "We stick together," Caleb countered firmly. "You taught me that." Ray recognized the steel in his son's voice, the same inflection he'd heard when Caleb returned from his second tour overseas, announcing he was done with war. Ray hadn't argued then, either. They moved on, the oppressive heat gradually yielding to evening's cooler embrace. As shadows lengthened, they discovered fresh scat partially covered with dirt, a territorial marker. Mira collected samples while Ray studied the surrounding area. "He's doubling back on his own trail," Ray noted, pointing to overlapping tracks. "Unusual behavior." "Could be disoriented from hunger," Mira suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. They made camp beneath a granite overhang, the natural shelter offering protection from nocturnal predators. Ray kept his rifle close as he unrolled his sleeping bag. 15 years ago, he'd awakened to find a mountain lion standing over him, close enough that its whiskers nearly brushed his face. He'd remained motionless, heart thundering, until the curious cat melted back into the darkness. As night fell, coyotes began their eerie chorus from distant ridges. Mira studied her samples by headlamp, while Caleb prepared a small, smokeless fire for heating food. "His diet is primarily deer," Mira reported. "No evidence of livestock or anything human-associated." Ray stared into the darkness beyond their camp. Then why is Ghost coming after people? The question hung in the air, unanswered as the stars emerged overhead. Dawn broke with a vengeance, the sun immediately scorching as they broke camp. Ray's sleep had been fitful, haunted by dreams of golden eyes watching from darkness. He swallowed 2 ibuprofen dry, the old leg injury throbbing like a second heartbeat. "Water situation," he asked Caleb, who was responsible for their supplies. 2 liters each, Caleb replied. there's supposed to be a spring 2 miles northeast, but with the drought. Ray nodded grimly. Dehydration was a silent killer in these mountains. 10 years back, he'd found a hiker's mummified remains, the man's dried lips still pressed to an empty canteen. They'd need to find water today or turn back tomorrow. They ascended through increasingly rugged terrain, the landscape transitioning from chaparral to scattered pine and boulder fields. The elevation gain made breathing laborious, lungs straining in the thin, hot air. Mira stumbled on loose scree, catching herself against a rock face that scraped her palm raw. "I'm fine," she insisted, wrapping the wound with a bandana before Ray could comment. By midday, they reached a ridgeline offering views across vast wilderness. Heat shimmer distorted the distance, but Ray's trained eyes caught a flash of movement on a far slope. "There," he whispered, passing the binoculars to Caleb. 2 o'clock, near that lightning-struck pine. Caleb focused, his breath catching. "I see him." The mountain lion moved with liquid grace along the ridge, tawny coat blending with the golden landscape. Then, inexplicably, it stopped and looked directly toward them. Impossible at this distance, unless it had detected their scent on the thermal currents. "He's watching us," Mira breathed, lowering her camera. "That's not normal behavior." The cat vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Ray checked his rifle, a practiced motion born of necessity rather than fear. 2 hunting seasons ago, he'd guided a client who panicked when confronted by a charging boar, nearly shooting Ray instead of the animal. The incident had left Ray with a graze wound across his ribs and a deep distrust of amateur hunters. They descended toward the location where Ghost had disappeared, moving into thicker forest that offered momentary relief from the sun, but brought new dangers, limited visibility, and more difficult tracking. The dried pine needles masked sound, making their approach stealthier, but also potentially hiding other predators. "Tracks," Caleb called softly, kneeling beside a disturbed patch of earth. "Heading southwest now." Ray frowned. "That's toward the Henderson property." "The site of the second livestock attack," Mira confirmed, consulting her notes. As the afternoon wore on, signs of Ghost became more frequent. A tuft of fur caught on a branch, fresh claw marks on a tree trunk, a half-eaten deer carcass less than a day old. They were closing in, yet Ray felt an unnerving sensation of being led. The spring they'd hoped to find was a dried hollow in the earth, cracked mud testimony to the drought's severity. Caleb rationed their remaining water, each receiving barely enough to wet their tongues. "We can't continue without water," Ray acknowledged, fighting frustration. "Not in this heat." As if nature heard their desperation, dark clouds began gathering over the distant peaks. The sudden temperature drop raised goosebumps on their sun-baked skin. "Flash flood country," Ray warned. "We need higher ground." Thunder rumbled ominously as they scrambled toward a rocky shelf. The storm's blessing of water came with the curse of lightning and rushing torrents that could sweep away the unwary. They'd have to weather this new threat before continuing their pursuit. Ghost was still out there, and strangely, Ray sensed the predator was waiting for them. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind glistening rocks and temporary streams that would vanish within hours. They collected rainwater in every available container, the unexpected bounty renewing their determination. Trails washed out, Caleb said, surveying the landscape below their shelter. Ray shouldered his pack. We don't need it anymore. What do you mean? Mira asked, securing her sample case. He's showing himself deliberately, Ray explained. Conventional tracking won't work now. We follow his lead. They descended cautiously, the wet ground treacherous underfoot. Twice Mira nearly fell, saved only by Caleb's quick reflexes. The humidity rose as the sun returned, creating a suffocating steam bath that sapped their energy. Insects swarmed in the moisture, drawn to sweat and breath. Near a rock formation split by lightning, Ray froze, raising his fist in the universal signal to halt. Ahead, Ghost sat calmly on a boulder, tail twitching, watching them with unnerving focus. He was close enough that they could see his whiskers catch the light. Ray slowly raised his rifle, finding the cat in his scope. The crosshairs settled on the vital area behind the shoulder. A clean kill shot. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. Ghost didn't move, didn't flee. Simply stared, almost expectant. Take the shot, Caleb whispered, tension evident in his voice. Ray's hands remained steady, but doubt clouded his mind. 20 years of hunting had taught him that prey runs. Predators stalk. Nothing sits exposed, offering itself. Something's wrong, he murmured, lowering the rifle slightly. As if responding to Ray's hesitation, Ghost stood, stretched leisurely, and trotted away. Not in panic, but with deliberate movement, pausing to look back at them. He wants us to follow, Mira said incredulously. They pursued, maintaining distance, but never losing sight of their quarry. The cat led them through a ravine where flash floodwaters still ran ankle-deep, across a meadow blooming with sudden life after the rain, and toward a stand of ancient oaks. As they walked, Ray recounted a story he'd never fully shared with Caleb. 6 years ago, I was guiding in Montana, grizzly country. Client wounded a bull elk that fled into thick timber. Against my better judgment, we followed the blood trail. Found ourselves between the dying elk and a sow with cubs. He paused, the memory still vivid. The client panicked, fired wildly. Hit me instead of the bear. Caleb stared at his father. You said that scar was from barbed wire. Spent 4 hours propped against a tree, keeping pressure on the wound while the client went for help. Ray continued. Bear could have finished me any time. Instead, she dragged her cubs away, kept circling back to check on me. Almost like she recognized I wasn't the threat. Anthropomorphizing is dangerous in our line of work, Mira cautioned. So is underestimating animal intelligence, Ray countered. Ahead, Ghost had stopped at the edge of a clearing. As they approached, he vanished into the underbrush, but not before Ray caught sight of something unusual. An awkward hitch in the cat's movement, favoring his left side. He's injured, Ray realized aloud. The clearing revealed signs of human presence. A crude campfire ring, empty shell casings, and something that made Ray's blood run cold. A broken arrow shaft smeared with dried blood. Poachers! Caleb spat. This changes everything, Ray said, understanding dawning. He's not hunting humans. He's seeking help from them, Mira finished, her scientific skepticism wavering before the evidence. The hunters had become the hunted, but not in the way they'd feared. They followed Ghost's trail up a narrow, winding game path that forced them into single file. Ray led, rifle ready but pointed downward. The vegetation pressed in from both sides, limiting visibility and movement. Any hunter would recognize the danger. They were being channeled, their options deliberately restricted. Perfect ambush territory, Caleb murmured, his military training evident in his heightened alertness. Ray nodded without speaking. Every instinct honed through decades in the wilderness screamed warning. Yet he continued forward. Something beyond logic or training drove him. Perhaps the same intuition that had saved his life countless times before. The path emerged suddenly into a natural amphitheater, formed by weathered granite boulders. Sunlight streamed through the gap above, illuminating the dust particles floating in the still air. And there, perched atop the highest rock, sat Ghost. The mountain lion's amber eyes fixed on them with eerie intelligence. His powerful muscles tensed beneath his tawny coat, but not in preparation to flee or attack. He seemed expectant. Ray raised his rifle by instinct, finding the cat in his scope. The perfect shot presented itself, a clean, ethical kill that would end their hunt successfully. His finger tensed on the trigger. "Ray," Mira's voice cut through his concentration. "Look at his left side." Shifting his aim slightly, Ray saw what had escaped his notice, a dark, matted patch on Ghost's flank. Something protruded from the fur, and even from this distance, Ray recognized the distinctive fletching of a hunting arrow. "He's wounded," Caleb confirmed, binoculars raised. "Looks infected." Ray lowered his rifle slowly. In his mind's eye, he saw the poacher's campsite again. The shell casings, the broken arrow shaft with dried blood. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. Ghost watched them, tail twitching occasionally, ears forward with interest, rather than laid back in aggression. The standoff stretched into minutes, neither human nor cat willing to make the first move. "He could have ambushed us a dozen times today," Ray said quietly. Instead, he showed himself repeatedly. "Led us here." That level of calculated behavior, Mira began, her scientific mind struggling with the implications, is exactly what an intelligent predator would do when desperate, Ray finished. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, a decision that made Caleb tense beside him. "What are you doing?" his son hissed. "Not what I came to do," Ray answered simply. He took a careful step forward, then another. Ghost's eyes tracked his movement, but the cat remained still. 20 feet from the boulder, Ray stopped and slowly lowered his pack to the ground. "I need your first aid kit," he said to Mira without turning, "and your satellite phone." "You can't be serious," Caleb protested. "That's a wild predator." "Who's smart enough to know he's dying and desperate enough to trust us?" Ray countered. "I've spent my life taking life from these mountains. Maybe it's time I gave something back." Mira approached cautiously, medical kit in hand. "Even if we could treat him, the wound looks severe. He needs antibiotics, proper veterinary care." "Then we'll get it for him," Ray said with finality, taking the satellite phone from her. He dialed the Fish and Wildlife Department, eyes never leaving the mountain lion, who watched their every move with unwavering attention. "This is Ray Blackwood," he said when the call connected. "We've located your problem cougar. Situation's changed. He's wounded, arrow in the flank, likely poisoned. We need a tranq team and a vet. fast. As Ray detailed their location, Ghost shifted position slightly, revealing more of his injury. The movement caused obvious pain, but the cat made no sound, his gaze remaining fixed on the humans who held his fate in their hands. The hunt had transformed into a rescue mission. The predator had become the vulnerable, and 3 humans found themselves at a moral crossroads none had anticipated when they set out to kill a mountain lion. The waiting tested them more severely than the tracking had. 3 hours passed, the sun arcing westward, throwing elongated shadows across the granite amphitheater. Ghost remained on his perch, occasionally shifting position, but never taking his eyes off the humans below. Ray sat cross-legged on the ground, his rifle within reach, but deliberately set aside. "Helicopters inbound," Caleb announced, returning from his position on a higher outcrop where he'd established radio contact. ETA 20 minutes. Mira knelt beside her open medical kit, preparing what limited supplies might help. "The infection's serious. You can see the inflammation from here." Ray nodded, his weathered face etched with concern. "Arrows poisoned, most likely. Poachers use toxins to ensure a kill, even with a poor shot." "How do you know?" Caleb asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Because I've seen it before," Ray admitted heavily. 10 years ago, these mountains were crawling with trophy hunters who didn't care about regulations. I wasn't always on the right side of that fight. The revelation hung between father and son, a glimpse into Ray's past that explained much about the man he'd become. The distant thrum of helicopter blades ended further conversation. Ghost's ears pricked forward at the unfamiliar sound, his muscles tensing visibly. "He'll bolt," Caleb warned, reaching for his rifle. "No." Ray raised a hand. "He's come this far trusting us. Give him the chance to see it through." The helicopter appeared above the ridge, thunderously loud in the natural amphitheater. Ghost rose to his feet, clearly agitated, but, remarkably, remaining in place. His eyes darted between the mechanical intruder and Ray, who stood slowly, making himself visible. "He's reading you," Mira observed with wonder, "taking his cues from your behavior." The aircraft set down in a meadow a quarter-mile distant, its downdraft bending the drought-stiffened grass. Minutes later, a team of 4 emerged on the trail, 2 wildlife officers carrying tranquilizer rifles, followed by a veterinarian and her assistant with medical equipment. Ghost watched their approach, muscles coiled with tension. When one officer raised his tranquilizer gun, the mountain lion growled. His first vocalization since they'd encountered him. "Wait." Ray stepped forward, positioning himself between the newcomers and Ghost. "Let him see you're not a threat." The wildlife officer hesitated, looking to his superior for guidance. The senior officer nodded grimly. "Blackwood's the best tracker in these mountains," he acknowledged. "If he says the cat's behaving unusually, I believe him." They approached more cautiously, allowing Ghost to observe them. The veterinarian, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, studied the wounded animal with professional detachment. "That's not a typical hunting arrow," she noted. "Custom broadhead, designed to deliver toxin. I've treated 3 deer with similar wounds this season." The tranquilizer shot, when it came, was expertly placed. Ghost flinched as the dart struck his hindquarter, then turned accusatory eyes toward Ray, who felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. Betrayal, even necessary betrayal, carried its own cost. As the drug took effect, Ghost tried to stand but stumbled, his coordination failing. He slid down the rock face with surprising grace, even in his compromised state. The team moved in with practiced efficiency, securing the unconscious predator before examining his wound. Arrowhead still embedded, the vet reported. Wounds severely infected. He's septic. Will he survive? Ray asked, the question catching in his throat. The veterinarian met his eyes. We'll do everything possible. That's all I can promise. As they loaded Ghost onto a stretcher for transport, Ray noticed something odd. A circular scar on the cat's right ear. He's tagged, the wildlife officer confirmed, checking the ear. Part of a university study 5 years ago. We have his history. Then you know he's never attacked humans before, Mira said, understanding dawning. The depredation permit was based on circumstantial evidence, the officer admitted. We may have been too quick to judge. Ghost disappeared into the helicopter, leaving Ray standing in the clearing with an unfamiliar emptiness. The hunt had ended, but not as anyone had expected. 4 weeks later, Ray's truck bounced along a remote fire road, deeper into wilderness than most vehicles ever ventured. Beside him sat Caleb, and in the back seat, Mira studied a tablet displaying Ghost's vital signs, transmitted from the new tracking collar fitted around the mountain lion's neck. Temperature normal, movement patterns consistent with healthy behavior, she reported. The antibiotics cleared the infection completely. Ray nodded, his eyes fixed on the rutted path ahead. The journey to this moment had been complicated. Bureaucratic hurdles, heated debates about Ghost's fate, and Ray's unexpected advocacy for an animal he'd been commissioned to kill. They parked at the road's end and continued on foot, hiking 2 miles to a predetermined release site. A small team from Fish and Wildlife awaited them, surrounding a large transport cage covered with a tarp. How is he? Ray asked the attending veterinarian. Restless. Ready? She gestured toward the cage. Would you like to see him before we open the door? Ray approached slowly. The veterinarian lifted one corner of the tarp, revealing Ghost lying alert inside the cage. The mountain lion's coat gleamed with health, the wound on his flank now a healing scar. His amber eyes found Ray's immediately, holding them with the same unnerving intelligence that had marked their first true encounter. The poachers have been arrested, the senior wildlife officer informed them, joining the group. Found them with 7 trophy heads and evidence of at least a dozen illegal kills. They're facing federal charges. And the other attacks attributed to Ghost? Mira asked. Forensic evidence cleared him of the livestock predation, the officer confirmed. Likely a younger male that moved into the territory while Ghost was weakened. Preparations for release continued around them. GPS coordinates confirmed, equipment checked, protocols reviewed. Ray remained by the cage, a silent communion passing between man and predator. You were right about him, Caleb said quietly, joining his father. He knew exactly what he was doing. Animals understand more than we credit them for, Ray replied. Took me most of my life to learn that lesson. The moment of release arrived with surprising simplicity. The cage door was opened remotely, and Ghost emerged cautiously, scanning his surroundings. He paused, scenting the air, then looked directly at Ray one final time. In that moment, Ray understood something fundamental had shifted within him. The mountains that had nearly claimed his life multiple times, through fall, dehydration, gunshot, and exposure, had finally taken something else from him: his perception of himself as separate from the wilderness. Ghost turned away, trotting toward the tree line with fluid grace. At the forest's edge, he paused, looking back once more before disappearing into the shadows. That behavior, Mira said, her scientific mind still processing. It contradicts everything we understand about mountain lion psychology. I've submitted a paper to the Journal of Wildlife Management proposing a re-evaluation of predator cognition based on this case. Academic journals, Ray said with a slight smile. That'll change things for sure. What will you do now? The wildlife officer asked Ray. Fish and Wildlife's offering more tracking contracts next season. Ray watched the trees where Ghost had vanished. Think I'm done with killing contracts. Caleb and I are restructuring the business. Wildlife photography tours, conservation tracking. Teaching people to see these animals as something other than threats or trophies. The group dispersed, equipment packed efficiently. As Ray turned to leave, something caught his attention. A flash of movement on a distant ridge. Ghost stood silhouetted against the sky, watching them depart. A sovereign presence reclaiming his domain. Extraordinary, Mira breathed, raising her camera. No, Ray said, gently lowering her lens. Let him have this moment without human interference. We've taken enough from him. The mountain lion turned away, vanishing into his wilderness. Ray felt no need to track where he went. Some things belong to the wild alone, beyond human understanding or control. That, perhaps, was the most important lesson these mountains had taught him.